The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Sweetwater Creek, silencing every soul in the small Montana town on that scorching August day in 1876. Clara Kincaid stood frozen on the wooden boardwalk, her white cotton dress stained with the blood of a man who dared to defend her honor, a man who wasn't Silas Oakley. Clara's reputation had been tarnished long before she'd set foot in Sweetwater Creek. The daughter of a prostitute who died of consumption, Clara had been forced to make her own way in a world that offered few choices to women without family or fortune. At 22, she'd traveled west with dreams of reinvention, only to find that whispers followed her wherever she went. "That Kincaid woman," they'd say when they thought she couldn't hear, their voices hushed yet sharp enough to cut. "Trouble follows her like a shadow." They whispered her name like dirt, a stain best avoided, a cautionary tale for their daughters. But Silas Oakley, the taciturn cowboy who'd arrived in town just months before Clara, spoke her name differently, reverently, carefully, as if it were a prayer that might save his soul. Now, as Sheriff Miller dragged away the shooter, a drunk miner who'd grabbed at Clara's skirts and wouldn't take no for an answer, Silas approached her with measured steps. His dusty hat was clutched in calloused hands, blue eyes earnest beneath a furrowed brow. "Miss Kincaid," he said softly, "let me see you home." Clara's fingers trembled against her blood-stained skirt. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Oakley." "It ain't charity," he replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It's respect." That word respect hung between them, foreign and precious. Clara had known many things in her 22 years. Hunger, fear, desperation. But respect had rarely been offered without conditions. "Very well," she finally said, ignoring the disapproving glances from the gathered townsfolk. They walked in silence through the main street, past the general store where Mrs. Patterson pointedly turned away, past the church where Reverend Thomas stood with folded arms and judgment in his eyes. Clara held her head high, though shame burned within her. Not shame for who she was, but shame that she cared what these people thought. Silas walked beside her, not behind or ahead, matching his long stride to her shorter one. He was a tall man, lean from hard work and sparse meals, with shoulders broad enough to carry the burdens of others. At 28, his face already showed the weathering of a life spent beneath the unforgiving sun. "They don't know you," he said suddenly, as they turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the small cabin Clara rented on the edge of town. "They know enough," Clara replied. Silas shook his head. "They know stories, not truth." Clara stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "And you think you know the truth, Mr. Oakley. We've exchanged perhaps 20 words before today." A small smile tugged at his lips. 23 by my count. "And no, I don't presume to know your truth, Miss Kincaid. I'd just like the chance to learn it." Something in his directness disarmed her. Clara had learned to read men quickly. It was a survival skill, and she saw no hidden motives in Silas Oakley's steady gaze. Just an earnestness that was rarer than gold in these parts. "Why would you want to do that?" she asked. "You've heard what they say about me." "I've heard men whisper your name like they're spitting in the dirt," he acknowledged. "Makes me wonder what they're afraid of." They resumed walking, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows before them. Clara's cabin came into view, small but tidy, with a tiny garden she'd started in defiance of the harsh climate and rocky soil. "Thank you for walking with me, Mr. Oakley," she said formally as they reached her door. Silas nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "Will you be all right?" The genuine concern in his voice nearly undid her. Clara swallowed hard. "I always am." "I've no doubt of that," he said, "but even the strongest souls need a friend sometimes." "Is that what you're offering, friendship?" Clara couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "For now," he replied simply. "Good evening, Miss Kincaid." Clara watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. She couldn't know then how those 3 words for now would change everything. The following morning, Clara awoke to find a bundle of wildflowers on her doorstep. No note, no name, but she knew who had left them. She placed them in a chipped cup, the closest thing she had to a vase, and set them on her small table. At the mercantile later that day, Clara endured the usual cold shoulder from Mrs. Patterson, who took her money with pinched lips and averted eyes. As Clara gathered her meager purchases, the store's bell jangled, announcing another customer. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson," came Silas's voice. "Morning, Miss Kincaid." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up at his deliberate acknowledgment of Clara. "Mr. Oakley," she replied stiffly. Clara nodded her greeting, acutely aware of the older woman's disapproving gaze following their exchange. "Heading back to your place?" Silas asked casually. "I'm going that direction myself. Mind if I walk with you?" Before Clara could respond, Mrs. Patterson sniffed loudly. "Mr. Oakley, a word of advice. A man in your position should be careful about the company he keeps. This town has standards." Silas's expression didn't change, but Clara noticed his jaw tighten slightly. "I appreciate your concern, madam," he said politely, "but I find I prefer to judge folks by their actions rather than rumors. Miss Kincaid has shown me nothing but dignity and grace." The older woman's face flushed red. Clara stood frozen, unused to anyone defending her, especially so publicly. Silas turned to Clara. "Shall we?" Outside in the bright sunlight, Clara finally found her voice. "You shouldn't have done that." "Done what?" "Defended me." Challenged her. "People will talk." Silas shrugged. "People already talk. Might as well give them something worth talking about." Despite herself, Clara smiled. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Oakley." "Most days a bit of both," he admitted with a wry grin. "And please call me Silas." "Silas," she repeated, testing the name. "I'm Clara." "I know," he said simply. They walked through town together, ignoring the stares and whispers. For the first time since arriving in Sweetwater Creek, Clara felt something other than isolation. It was a dangerous feeling, this tentative connection. Hope was a luxury she'd long ago stopped affording herself. "What brought you to Sweetwater Creek?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man who seemed determined to befriend her. "Work, mostly," he replied. "I've been drifting since the war, taking ranch jobs where I can find them. The Double S was hiring, and I needed somewhere to winter." "You fought in the war?" Clara glanced at him with new understanding. Though not much older than her, Silas would have been just the right age to have served in the final years of the conflict. He nodded once. "Joined up in '64 when I was 16. Lied about my age. You saw combat." She could see it now in the way he carried himself, in the wariness that occasionally shadowed his eyes. "Some," he said, and his tone made it clear he wouldn't elaborate. "What about you? What brought you here?" Clara hesitated. Her story wasn't one easily told. "A fresh start," she finally said, "or the hope of one." Silas seemed to understand what remained unspoken. Sweetwater Creek isn't known for second chances, but maybe it should be. They had reached her cabin again. This time, Clara didn't immediately retreat inside. "Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can offer after you braved Mrs. Patterson's wrath on my behalf." Surprise and pleasure flashed across his face. "I'd like that very much." Inside, Clara busied herself with her small stove, acutely aware of Silas taking in her modest home. The cabin was spare but clean, with a few touches that made it hers: a patchwork quilt on the narrow bed, a shelf of well-worn books, dried flowers hanging from the ceiling beams. "You've made this place your own," he observed. "I try," she replied, pouring water into the battered coffee pot. It's not much, but it's mine. That counts for a lot in this world. They sat at her small table, steam rising from their cups, and talked. Really talked, in a way Clara couldn't remember doing with anyone in years. Silas told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to fever when he was 14, about joining the Union Army out of desperation as much as patriotism. He spoke of working cattle drives after the war, of sleeping beneath stars from Texas to Montana. In turn, Clara shared pieces of herself carefully at first, then with growing trust. She told him about her mother, who'd been kind despite her profession, and had taught Clara to read and write before consumption took her. About the series of boarding houses and temporary arrangements that followed. About her determination to make a different life for herself out west. What she didn't tell him not yet was about the man in St. Louis who'd promised marriage and delivered betrayal instead. The man whose lies had forced her to flee westward with her reputation in tatters and his false accusations ringing in her ears. As the afternoon light began to fade, Silas reluctantly stood to leave. "Thank you for the coffee," he said, "and the company." "Will I see you again?" The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. Silas smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "Count on it." Over the following weeks, Silas became a regular visitor to Clara's cabin. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a book of poetry he'd found in the general store, fresh eggs from the ranch, wildflowers gathered from the prairie. More precious than these tangible offerings was the gift of his time, freely given despite the growing whispers in town. Silas seemed impervious to the gossip, but Clara worried. She knew how towns like Sweetwater Creek worked. A man could survive many things, but once he was deemed an outcast, work became scarce and life grew dangerous. "You should stop coming around so much," she told him one evening as they sat on her small porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. "Mr. Sullivan at the Double S won't keep you on if you keep associating with me." Silas considered this, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. "Sullivan's a fair man, judges a cowhand by his work, not his friends." Even so," he interrupted gently. "I'd rather have your company than the approval of folks who judge without knowing." Clara studied his profile in the fading light. "You're a stubborn man, Silas Oakley." "So I've been told," he chuckled. "Usually right before I get myself into trouble." That made her laugh, a sound rare enough that Silas turned to look at her with something like wonder. "You should do that more often," he said softly. "What?" "Laugh. It suits you." The air between them changed, charged suddenly with unspoken possibilities. Clara looked away first, her heart racing traitorously. "It's getting late," she said. "You should go before it's full dark." Silas nodded, respecting her boundaries as he always did. He stood and settled his hat on his head. "I've got the day off tomorrow. Thought I might go fishing up at the creek. You're welcome to join me if you'd like." Clara hesitated. Their visits had always been here at her cabin, away from prying eyes. Venturing out together would be different, a public declaration of whatever this was between them. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Silas tipped his hat. "I'll be there from mid-morning on, North Bend, where the cottonwoods grow thick." That night, Clara barely slept, torn between caution and longing. By dawn, she had made her decision. The morning was glorious, the kind that made Montana's harsh winters worth enduring. Clara packed a simple lunch and walked the mile and a half to the creek, following the path through waving grasses that reached her waist in places. She spotted Silas before he saw her sitting on the bank, his hat beside him, fishing pole held loosely in his hands. He looked younger somehow, more at ease. When he finally noticed her approaching, his smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "You came," he said simply. I came, she echoed, suddenly shy. They spent the day by the creek, fishing with more conversation than skill, sharing the lunch Clara had brought. Silas taught her to bait a hook properly, his hands gentle as they guided hers. They talked about books. Clara loved the romantic poets, while Silas had a fondness for adventure tales. They debated whether Montana would change with statehood, whether the railroad would ever reach Sweetwater Creek, whether the coming winter would be harsh or mild. What they didn't discuss was the future, or what they might be to each other. That unnamed thing between them remained delicate, too new to bear the weight of definition. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they lay side by side on a blanket Silas had brought, watching clouds drift overhead. Their hands lay inches apart, not quite touching. Clara, Silas said quietly. There's something I need to ask you, her heart stuttered. Yes, the things people say about you in town. He began carefully. I don't put stock in gossip, but I'd rather hear the truth from you than wonder. Clara sat up, drawing her knees to her chest. She'd known this moment would come eventually. What exactly have you heard? She asked, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. Silas sat up too, facing her. That you were run out of St. Louis for. Improper behavior. That you've had relations with married men. That you're no better than you ought to be. Each accusation landed like a physical blow, but Clara didn't flinch. And you want to know if it's true. I want to know your story, he corrected gently. Not their version of it. Clara looked out over the creek, gathering her courage. I was a companion to an elderly widow in St. Louis, Mrs. Hargrove. She was kind to me, treated me almost like a daughter. Her son, Edward, began to pay me attention. He was handsome, charming, and I was young and foolish enough to believe his promises. She paused, the memories still painful. He was engaged to another woman the entire time, a fact he neglected to mention. When his fiancée discovered our friendship, Edward claimed I had seduced him, that I'd tried to trap him into marriage. His mother believed him, of course. I was dismissed without a reference, and Edward's fiancée made sure everyone in St. Louis society knew what kind of woman I was. And the married men? Silas asked quietly. Edward was the only man I'd ever. Clara felt heat rise to her face. But once a woman's reputation is damaged, people assume the worst. I came west hoping to escape that, but somehow the rumors followed me. Or perhaps I just found a town eager to believe the worst of a woman alone. Silas was silent for a long moment. Clara couldn't bring herself to look at him, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. Thank you for telling me, he finally said. Does it change how you see me? She forced herself to meet his gaze. Yes, he answered honestly, and her heart sank. But then he continued, it makes me admire your strength even more. Clara blinked back sudden tears. You believe me? Why wouldn't I? He asked simply. You've never given me reason to doubt your word. Most people find it easier to believe the worst. Silas reached out slowly and took her hand in his. It was the first time he had touched her deliberately, beyond the accidental brushes that had occurred between them. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. I'm not most people, Clara. The way he said her name like it was something precious, something sacred, made her breath catch. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up to his face. The tenderness in his eyes undid her last defenses. When Silas leaned forward, moving slowly enough that she could have pulled away, Clara met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, a question asked and answered in the meeting of lips. When they parted, Silas rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if in prayer. I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you, he confessed. Why didn't you? She whispered. His eyes opened, serious and intent. Because some things are worth waiting for. They returned to town as the sun was setting, walking close but not touching, both aware of how appearances mattered in a place like Sweetwater Creek. Still, there was a new understanding between them, a bridge crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. At her doorstep, Silas kissed her again, briefly but firmly. "Sleep well, Clara," he murmured. She watched him walk away, wondering how her life had changed so completely in the span of one day. The following morning, Clara went to her job at the town's small hotel, where she worked 3 days a week cleaning rooms. The owner's wife, Mrs. Jenkins, was waiting for her with a pinched expression. "I'm afraid we won't be needing your services anymore, Miss Kincaid," she said without preamble. Clara stood very still. "May I ask why? Has my work been unsatisfactory?" "Your work is not the issue," Mrs. Jenkins replied, not quite meeting her eyes. "It's just that, well, we have a certain reputation to maintain. Our guests expect a respectable establishment. And I am suddenly not respectable enough." Clara kept her voice level with effort. Mrs. Jenkins twisted her hands in her apron. "People are talking, Miss Kincaid, about you and that cowboy, Mr. Oakley, gallivanting around in public with no regard for propriety." Anger flared hot in Clara's chest. "We went fishing, Mrs. Jenkins, in broad daylight. There was nothing improper about it." "Nevertheless," the older woman said firmly, "my decision is final. You'll be paid what you're owed." Clara accepted the small envelope of coins with as much dignity as she could muster and walked out, her back straight despite the humiliation burning through her. She had known there would be consequences for being seen with Silas, but the swiftness of them took her by surprise. By midday, word had spread through town. When Clara ventured to the general store for supplies, conversations hushed as she entered, and Mrs. Patterson's usual coldness had hardened into open hostility. "I'm afraid I can't serve you today," the shopkeeper said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Our stock is reserved for regular customers." Clara stood her ground. "I have been a regular customer for 8 months, Mrs. Patterson. I pay in full and I've never asked for credit." "Perhaps you should try the trading post outside of town," Mrs. Patterson suggested with false sweetness. "I hear they're less particular about their clientele." The trading post was 10 miles away, an impossible journey on foot. Clara looked around at the watching faces, finding only judgment and satisfaction in her humiliation. Without another word, she turned and left the store. Outside, she leaned against the building, fighting back tears of frustration. She had been barely tolerated before. Now she was being actively ostracized, all because she had dared to spend time with a man who treated her with respect. "Miss Kincaid." A hesitant voice interrupted her thoughts. Clara looked up to see Sarah Turner, the blacksmith's young wife, standing before her with a concerned expression. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked. "I overheard what happened in there." Clara straightened, embarrassed to be caught in a moment of weakness. "I'm fine, thank you." Sarah glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "If you need supplies, I'd be happy to purchase them for you. Daniel and I don't hold with Mrs. Patterson's manner of judgment." The unexpected kindness nearly undid Clara. "That's very generous of you, but I wouldn't want to cause trouble for you and your husband." "Nonsense," Sarah said firmly. "It would be my pleasure. Make a list of what you need and I'll bring it to your cabin this afternoon." Clara looked at the younger woman with new appreciation. Sarah and Daniel Turner had always been polite to her, but this offer went beyond mere courtesy. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I won't forget this." True to her word, Sarah appeared at Clara's door that afternoon with a basket of supplies. "Mrs. Patterson's face when I bought double my usual order," she laughed. She knew exactly what I was doing, but she couldn't very well refuse to serve the blacksmith's wife. Clara invited her in for tea, and to her surprise, Sarah accepted. As they sat together, Clara realized how much she had missed female companionship. Sarah was open and unaffected, talking about her life with Daniel and their hopes for starting a family soon. "I've noticed Mr. Oakley calling on you," Sarah said with a smile. "He seems like a good man." Clara tensed, waiting for judgment, but Sarah's expression remained friendly. "He is," Clara agreed cautiously. "Daniel says he's one of the hardest workers at the Double S, honest too." Sarah stirred her tea thoughtfully. "This town can be hard on people who don't conform. Daniel and I felt it when we first arrived. Him being Irish Catholic and me a Methodist, you'd think we'd committed high treason to hear some talk." "Yet you stayed," Clara observed. Sarah nodded. "We decided their opinions mattered less than our happiness together." It took time, but eventually most folks came around. "I'm not sure that will happen in my case," Clara said wryly. "The town seems to have made up its mind about me." "People can surprise you," Sarah replied. "And those who can't change aren't worth your worry anyway." After Sarah left, Clara considered her words. She had been living in defensive isolation for so long, expecting rejection at every turn. Perhaps it was time to stop giving others the power to define her worth. That evening, Silas arrived at her door with concern etched on his features. "I heard about the hotel," he said without preamble, "and the store. Clara, I'm so sorry." She invited him in, touched by his obvious distress. "It's not your fault." "It is," he insisted. "If I hadn't been so public about my intentions, your intentions," Clara interrupted, raising an eyebrow. Silas flushed slightly. "My interest in you," he amended. "I knew how this town operates, and I still put you in a difficult position." "I chose to go fishing with you," she reminded him. "I knew there might be consequences." He paced her small cabin, frustration evident in every line of his body. "It's not right. You've done nothing wrong." "Neither have you," she said softly. "Sit down, Silas, please." He sank into a chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "I heard Sullivan talking with the foreman today. There's pressure from some of the local ranchers to let me go." Clara's stomach dropped. "Because of me." "Because I won't play by their rules," he corrected her. "Sullivan's resisting so far, says I'm too valuable to lose before winter roundup, but," he shrugged, "jobs are scarce this time of year." They sat in silence for a moment, the reality of their situation hanging heavy between them. "Perhaps we should be more careful," Clara suggested reluctantly. "Not see each other for a while until the talk dies down." Silas looked at her intently. "Is that what you want?" "No," she admitted. "But I don't want you to lose your livelihood because of me." He leaned forward, taking her hands in his. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Her heart quickened at the seriousness in his tone. "All right. You have feelings for me." Real feelings, not just gratitude or friendship. The directness of the question took her aback. Clara had been guarding her heart for so long that acknowledging her feelings, even to herself, was frightening. But Silas deserved honesty. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." Relief and joy transformed his face. "Then the rest doesn't matter. We'll figure it out together." "It's not that simple," she protested. "This town isn't the only town," he interrupted. "We could leave, start fresh somewhere else." The suggestion stunned her. "You do that?" "Leave everything behind." Silas's gaze was steady. "What would I be leaving, Clara? I've been a drifter most of my life. The only thing keeping me in Sweetwater Creek is sitting right in front of me." His words unleashed a flood of emotion in Clara, hope and fear, and a desperate longing for what he was offering. "I barely know you," she whispered. "You know the important parts," he countered. "The rest we'll learn together." Clara withdrew her hands from his, needing space to think. "I can't ask you to uproot your life for me." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Silas watched her carefully. "Think about it at least. We don't have to decide anything tonight." She nodded, grateful for the reprieve. "I'll think about it." That night, after Silas had gone, Clara lay awake weighing possibilities. Leave Sweetwater Creek. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had come here hoping for a fresh start, only to find herself trapped in the same patterns of judgment and exclusion. Perhaps Silas was right, perhaps somewhere else. They could build something real together, without the weight of her past hanging over them. But doubt crept in with the darkness. What if Silas came to regret his decision? What if, away from the opposition that united them, he discovered Clara wasn't what he wanted after all? She had trusted a man once before, with disastrous consequences. Yet Silas was nothing like Edward Hargrove. Where Edward had been smooth and practiced, Silas was forthright and genuine. Where Edward had hidden his true intentions, Silas had been open about his feelings from the start. By morning, Clara had made her decision. She was hanging laundry in the pale October sunshine when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she was surprised to see not Silas, but Sheriff Miller riding toward her cabin. The lawman's expression was grim as he dismounted. "Miss Kincaid," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "May I have a word?" Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Of course, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" Miller seemed uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "There was an incident at the Double S Ranch early this morning, a disagreement that got out of hand." Fear clutched at Clara's throat. "Silas." "Is he, Mr. Oakley's alive?" Miller assured her quickly. "But he's been hurt." One of the other hands, Joe Blackburn, took exception to some comments Mr. Oakley made. "Drew a knife on him." "How badly is he hurt?" Clara asked, already untying her apron. "Bad enough." "Doc Wilson's with him now at the ranch. Mr. Sullivan sent me to fetch you." Clara was momentarily taken aback. "Mr. Sullivan sent you?" The sheriff nodded. "Said Oakley's been asking for you. Figured it was only right you should know." 10 minutes later, Clara was riding behind Sheriff Miller, anxiety knotting her stomach. They reached the Double S in record time, Miller leading her directly to a small cabin at the edge of the ranch compound. Inside, she found Silas lying on a narrow bunk, his face pale against the pillow. "Doctor." Wilson stood nearby, packing instruments into his bag. Sullivan, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, hovered in the doorway. "Clara," Silas said weakly, attempting to sit up when he saw her. "Stay still, you fool," Dr. Wilson admonished. "Those stitches won't hold if you keep thrashing about." Clara rushed to Silas's side, taking in the bandages wrapped around his torso. "What happened?" Dr. Wilson answered for him. "Knife wound to the left side. Deep, but it missed anything vital. He's lucky." "Blackburn had too much to drink," Sullivan explained from the doorway. "Started running his mouth about you, Miss Kincaid. Oakley took exception, told him to shut it. One thing led to another." Clara looked at Silas in dismay. "You fought over me." "Not exactly how I'd put it," Silas muttered. Dr. Wilson snapped his bag shut. "He needs rest and careful watching for the next day or two. Keep the wound clean, change the bandages twice daily. If fever sets in, send for me immediately." After the doctor left, Sullivan stepped closer to the bed. "Blackburn's been let go," he told Silas. "Should have done it months ago. Man's always been trouble." "Thank you, sir," Silas replied. Sullivan turned to Clara. "Miss Kincaid, I don't mean to presume, but Oakley here needs looking after. The bunkhouse isn't the place for a healing man, what with the noise and dirt. I've spoken with my wife, and we agree he'd recover better with proper care." "Sir," Silas looked confused. "What I'm saying," Sullivan continued, "is that if Miss Kincaid is willing to nurse you at her place, the ranch will provide whatever supplies are needed. It would be a help to us, frankly. We're short-handed as it is with Roundup coming." Clara realized Sullivan was offering a solution that preserved both Silas's health and his dignity. "I would be happy to care for Mr. Oakley," she said formally. "Good, that's settled then." Sullivan nodded briskly. "Miller, help me get this stubborn cowboy into the wagon." Despite Silas's protests that he could walk, the two men carefully transferred him to a waiting wagon. Clara sat beside him for the slow journey to her cabin, acutely aware of the curious stares that followed them through town. By the time they had Silas settled in Clara's bed, he was pale and sweating from the exertion. "This isn't how I imagined getting you to invite me to stay," he joked weakly as she tucked blankets around him. Clara smiled despite her worry. "Hush and rest. Doctor's orders." Over the next few days, Clara barely left Silas's side. The wound showed no signs of infection, and color gradually returned to his face. Sullivan's wife sent over nourishing meals and extra blankets, while Sarah Turner visited daily, bringing fresh bandages and news from town. On the third day, as Clara was changing Silas's bandages, he caught her hand. "Thank you," he said seriously, "for taking care of me." "You do the same for me," she replied. "In a heartbeat," he agreed. "Still, it can't be easy having a man taking up your only bed." Clara smoothed the fresh bandage over his wound. "I don't mind the pallet on the floor. Besides, it's only temporary." Silas watched her carefully. "Have you thought about what we discussed, about leaving?" She nodded. "I have." And Clara sat on the edge of the bed. I think I'd like to try. Somewhere new where we can both start fresh." The smile that broke across Silas's face was like sunshine after rain. He reached for her, drawing her down until she was nestled against his uninjured side. "Where shall we go?" he asked, his breath warm against her hair. "I've always wanted to see California," she admitted. "They say the valleys are green all year round." "California it is," he agreed readily. "Once I'm healed enough to travel." They lay together, planning their future in quiet voices. Oregon was mentioned as a possibility too, or perhaps Washington territory. Somewhere with fertile land and rain enough to grow things, somewhere they could build a home together. "Clara," Silas said seriously, when their conversation had drifted into comfortable silence, "there's something I need to ask you." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Yes. I don't have much to offer. No land, no fortune, just my hands and my heart. But I love you, Clara Kincaid. I think I've loved you since that first day when you held your head high despite everything. I want to build a life with you wherever that may be. Will you marry me?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Are you certain? Once you do this, there's no going back." "I've never been more certain of anything," he said firmly. She touched his face gently, tracing the lines that sun and hardship had etched there. "Then yes, Silas Oakley, I will marry you." He pulled her down for a kiss that sealed their promise, wincing only slightly when the movement tugged at his wound. 2 weeks later, with Silas healing well but still moving carefully, they stood before Reverend Thomas in the small Sweetwater Creek church. To Clara's surprise, the Reverend had agreed to perform the ceremony without hesitation when Silas had asked. "God's grace extends to all who seek it," he had said simply. "Who am I to do less?" The church was nearly empty, just Sarah and Daniel Turner as witnesses, and, unexpectedly, Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan in the back pew. Clara wore her best dress, freshly pressed, with wildflowers in her hair. Silas stood tall in a borrowed suit, his eyes never leaving her face as they spoke their vows. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt a lifetime of burdens lift from her shoulders. In Silas's kiss was the promise of all that lay ahead, not an easy path, perhaps, but one they would walk together. After the ceremony, Sullivan approached them with an unexpected offer. "I've got a cousin in Oregon," he said. "Owns a good-sized spread near Salem. He's looking for an experienced ranch hand who might grow into a foreman someday. Told him all about you, Oakley. Job's yours if you want it." Silas looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. She squeezed his hand in answer. "We'd be much obliged, Mr. Sullivan," Silas replied. "When should we leave?" "Spring would be soon enough," Sullivan said. "Give you time to heal properly and prepare for the journey. In the meantime, there's a small cabin on the north edge of my property. Previous hand left last month. It's nothing fancy, but it's solid and private. You're welcome to it until you head west." Later that evening, in the privacy of their new cabin, Clara and Silas held each other close. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Silas traced her cheek with gentle fingers. "You know, when I first came to Sweetwater Creek, I heard them whisper your name like you were something to be feared, something dirty. And yet you spoke to me anyway," she mused. "I saw a woman holding herself with dignity despite everything. How could I not be drawn to that strength?" He kissed her forehead. "When I say your name, Clara Oakley, I say it like the blessing it is." 5 months later, as spring painted the Montana landscape with new life, Clara and Silas Oakley loaded their few possessions onto a wagon and bid farewell to Sweetwater Creek. To their surprise, a small group gathered to see them off: the Turners, the Sullivans, even Reverend Thomas and his wife. "The West is full of fresh starts," Sullivan said, shaking Silas's hand firmly. "You two make the most of yours." Sarah Turner hugged Clara tightly. "Right when you're settled," she insisted. "I want to hear all about Oregon." As they pulled away, Clara looked back at the town that had nearly broken her. Strange how a place that had once felt like a prison now seemed smaller, less significant. Sweetwater Creek had given her pain, yes, but it had also given her Silas. For that she could find forgiveness. "Ready?" Silas asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. Clara leaned into his strength, facing forward toward the horizon and all that awaited them. "Ready." 5 years later, Salem, Oregon. Clara Oakley stood on the porch of their farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the Willamette Valley in shades of gold. The air was sweet with the scent of ripening apples from their small orchard, a gentle reminder of how far they had come from the dusty streets of Sweetwater Creek. Inside, she could hear Silas's deep voice singing their 3-year-old daughter to sleep, little Emma, named for Clara's mother, with Silas's blue eyes and Clara's determined spirit. In the cradle nearby, their 6-month-old son Michael slept soundly, his tiny fists curled against the blanket Clara had lovingly sewn during her pregnancy. The Oakley farm was modest, but thriving: 20 acres of good land, with fields of wheat, the young orchard, and a small herd of dairy cows. Silas still worked part-time for Sullivan's cousin, whose ranch bordered their property, but more and more of his energy went into building their own place. Clara ran her hand over the porch railing Silas had built last summer. Every board in this house, every fence post, every carefully tended tree represented their shared dream taking physical form. Sometimes, she still marveled at the journey that had brought them here, how close they had come to missing each other entirely. The screen door creaked and Silas stepped out to join her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Emma's finally asleep," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Insisted on 3 stories tonight." Clara laughed softly. "She's as stubborn as her father." "And as charming as her mother," he countered, turning her in his arms to face him. After 5 years of marriage, Silas still looked at Clara with the same wonder as he had on their wedding day. "I had a letter from Sarah today," Clara told him, leaning into his embrace. "She and Daniel are expecting their 2nd child in December, and she says Sweetwater Creek is growing. The railroad finally came through." "Do you ever regret leaving?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. Clara shook her head. "Not for a moment. Everything I need is right here." As the last light faded from the valley, They stood together in comfortable silence. From inside came the soft sounds of their children's breathing, the most precious music Clara had ever known. "Mrs. Oakley," Silas said softly, the way he always did, like a prayer of thanksgiving. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" Clara smiled up at her husband, the man who had seen her worth when others saw only shadows. "Tell me again," she whispered. And as night fell gently around their home, he did.